Hello, Brooke. Thank you so much for joining us on Raising Teens.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, Brooke, I heard you speak, I think it was last year during NAIDOC week, and I just would love my listeners to get a bit of a snapshot of your own heritage and what you're doing now. They would have heard your bio already, but just give us a little bit of an idea of anything you like about your history and your heritage.
Yeah, so I'm a Wakka woman. Wakka Nation is one of the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. Wakka country is about 3 hours drive northwest of Brisbane, of Meanjin. But I was actually born on Indigenous country up in far north Queensland and grew up on Gubbi country, and specifically Redcliffe, just north of Brisbane. That's the southernmost point of Gubbi country. And Gubbi country extends up the Sunshine Coast of Queensland. And then Wakka is the neighbouring nation to the west of Gubbi country. And so I did all of my schooling, all my growing up, and have lived most of my life on Gubbi country. And then the last 3 years have lived in the place now called Sydney, on the lands of the Gadigal and the Wongal peoples, the Eora Nation. And so they're all important parts of my identity. My Aboriginality comes through my maternal line. So my mum, back to my mum's mum, my nan's mum, my great-grandmother, and then all of our generations before that from Wakka country. And so for Aboriginal people, where we're from isn't necessarily where we've grown up or lived. Where we're from is where our family heritage is from. And so for me, that's Wakka country. And today I actually have the privilege of living on Wakka country. And some of the distinctives of Wakka country are our beautiful bunya pines. They're a very ancient and quite a spiritual looking tree. They're quite distinctive. Numerous native grasslands are also a feature of Wakka country. And I especially love to watch the sunrise and the sunset on my country.
So, Brooke, my eldest two, they were privileged enough to go to a school where they were able to visit and spend time with Indigenous communities and elders. They spent time in South Australia, Northern Territory, and even in Māori in New South Wales. And they just got to listen and learn. Now, you can hear, and my listeners know, I wasn't born in Australia, and there's a big migrant population in Australia. And so people like myself, we didn't grow up learning about or understanding about Indigenous or Aboriginal culture. So for people like me, would you give us some kind of idea of appropriate terms, appropriate customs, things that are really important to Aboriginal peoples? Kind of a quick lesson perhaps that you might do in schools or with Australian parents, anything that
Yes.
you think is important for us to know or recognise?
Yes. No, that's a great question and one that I get asked all of the time. And it's not just for recent migrants. There's people whose generations have been here for 8 generations, if we think about the last 200 to 250 years, who are still learning this information as well. But I guess my hope for more recent migrants is that there is a desire to immediately listen and learn and love Aboriginal peoples, which hasn't been the experience of the last over 200 years. And so what I hope is that people just come with love and respect and compassion. And through those things, learn which is the right term to use, and don't to not let not knowing the right terminology prevent you from entering the listening, learning, and loving, and the relationship if you have the opportunity to meet, or even like listening through podcasts is an important part of building relationship with Aboriginal peoples. So some of the terms, many of them are correct, but I often always use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it does often come to a personal preference for us. So you do have to listen, because you'll take on the language that the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Indigenous person is using to reflect the language that they're comfortable with. That personal preference sadly often comes from how another term might have been used in a racist context towards us.
Okay.
So I use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples partly because I am Aboriginal, I'm not Torres Strait. So Aboriginal
Okay.
peoples, over 300 nations across these lands now called Australia. The Torres Strait Islander peoples uh, come from, there are 100, over 100 islands in the Torres Strait, which is the body of water between the tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea. And we have very separate cultures between Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples. One of those is our musical instruments. Aboriginal people known for our clapsticks, didgeridoos or yidaki. Torres Strait Islanders a big drum that they use, a special Torres Strait Islander drum. Different types of dances. And also there's the diversity between Aboriginal peoples from over 300 nations and the Torres Strait Islanders amongst their different islands. But Indigenous, we both collectively, Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are the Indigenous peoples of Australia. So when I'm talking in a global and world context, that's when I'll use Indigenous.
Okay.
Sadly, one of the reasons I also don't use Indigenous is because of the way it's being used racistly. Some predominantly white Australians will say that they're Indigenous because the grammatical and dictionary definition means born of the land, and so they use it to like deny our identity, which is really hurtful. And there's
Okay.
a number of other personal situations where Indigenous sadly has been used racistly against me. It's also geographical. I come from the second largest Aboriginal community in Australia, which is Brisbane, the largest being Sydney. Sydney is the largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population community in Australia. There are more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Sydney than the whole of the Northern Territory. And so this is
Wow.
part of the education that I do as well. So, because people just don't realize, we're often probably, if you're living in the capital cities,
Yes.
we're more likely to be your next door neighbour. And I
That's
guess it's
incredible.
lifting the veil as to who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are today. We are the world's oldest living, continuing cultures, and but people's perception of what we might look like isn't necessarily the reality. So we come in
Yeah.
every shade and colour in terms of our skin colour, and that's not what determines whether we're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. It's where our family heritage has come from. Some of us have fairer skin, and if you don't know why that is, then you don't know the true history of this
Yeah.
country.
Yeah.
And
I've heard
so
you talk
we're
about
very accepting, and hospitality and generosity are core parts of our culture.
so I've heard you talk, you mentioned fairer skin, and I've heard you talk about how that's been used in hurtful ways to you. So, yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Yes, and it's the one thing, particularly as I work with young people, teens, and children today, that if that's something that they can get at that young age, then we're setting up for a better Australia for all Australians. And
Yeah.
often it's still happening in schools that I go into. The students will say, "Oh, you don't look Aboriginal." And it's like, well, who do you think does look like an
Yeah.
Aboriginal person? And so educating those young people who then go home and talk about the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and the leadership from meeting one Aboriginal person is, and I always bring other Aboriginal leaders into the sessions that I do. So these young people get to learn our great Aboriginal, particularly Aboriginal Christian leaders, but who have also been incredible leaders and social justice and civil rights leaders. So, like William Cooper, Pearl Gibbs, today's Aboriginal Christian leaders like Auntie Jean Phillips, Uncle Pastor Ray
Yeah.
Minnicon, and yeah, to see our beautiful diversity and leadership.
Just out of interest, I often hear you use the term the land we now call Australia. Can you just elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, so it's actually these lands now called Australia.
Okay,
And
thank you.
it's my way of trying to be really honouring as well as a part of truth telling. Australia often decides for us as Aboriginal peoples when we're included and when we're excluded, and we feel that every day. And so I want an Australia that obviously embraces and celebrates the world's oldest living continuing cultures. And we've still got a long way to go in this country, in
Right.
Australia, to do that. But these lands, I'm bringing honour to the over 300 nations. So they're these lands. There's many lands that have now made
Okay.
up what has now been called Australia. So it hasn't always been Australia. There was never one name for this land mass, because we are 300 nations
I
and
think
then
that's
the
what
100 islands in the
fascinated.
coast.
I was fascinated when you showed a map of that. That was incredible to me when it dawned on me it wasn't one place.
That's right. And, today we use the word nations instead of tribes because we had whole systems of law and living and governance. And we still do today. And particularly when I'm working with teens and young people and children, they love learning about that because, we were never nomadic hunter gatherers, and we're still trying to overcome that term and how that has set in people's minds. And it was never true. You could
Okay.
look at that map, and it's actually the AATSIS Indigenous map of Australia, and people can purchase that. I want to see one in every classroom in Australia. I want to see one in every church, and I'd even love to see one in every home, so that people can start to learn. And it's not a perfect map, but there are many nations missing, but it's a good representation and actually helps you to open your eyes to what has been here for thousands of years and still today.
Yeah, thank you. So, and feel free at any point on this podcast to correct me on my terminology. I think I loved when I heard you speak. You said, "Be open to learning," and so I'm open to being wrong. And I think when I heard you speak, you were the first person that I heard made me feel as though, as a white Western woman, not to be afraid to admit that I don't know, and asking you and asking Aboriginal people, what terminology do you prefer, or am I saying something that's hurtful? I felt relief when you said that to me. I thought,
Yeah.
okay, that uh, you. I feel invited to have a conversation with you, and I don't have to worry if I'm being offensive, because you are actually open to me saying, I know I might be offensive. Please could you help me? So thank you for doing
Yeah.
that, Brooke. On this podcast, we talk a lot about how COVID has affected teenagers really around the world. What have you noticed about the effects of COVID on Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal young people? Have there been patterns that you have seen?
Yes, it's been very interesting. I mean, I think at a bigger level, it was very. This is how people can learn the true history of Australia, as Australia and our governments, both federal and state and territory, looked at what to do, and state borders started to close, and travel was restricted. That's not the first time it's ever happened in these lands now called Australia. And so I've used it as a tool to explain, this was one of the results of the 1967 referendum. That before that, the states and territories restricted the movement of Aboriginal peoples. And not to cross the state border, you couldn't even leave your community or your reserve or your mission. So here on Wakka Wakka country, we have Cherbourg Reserve and Mission. You had to get permission to leave that very small community. And often that permission
Yeah,
was denied. And so we've lived this, and this is where the relationship also needs to come between non-Indigenous people and Aboriginal people, to understand that we lived through that for a long, like decades, if not over
yeah.
a century. And so I hope that drives a compassion for what Aboriginal people experienced, and being removed from your families and not able to see them. And, I'm not trying to relate the two together, but COVID gives you a very small insight into what might have happened to Aboriginal people, or what did happen to Aboriginal peoples.
Yeah, I
And then I
hadn't
think the other
considered that.
sad,
That's a good illustration.
yeah, and I think the other sad reality of um, what COVID meant for particularly Aboriginal peoples was that in some instances there wasn't much difference because of the poverty that exists. And even though I use the term poverty, I really want people to see Aboriginal people as very resilient, adaptable, strong, courageous. But the reality, and it's part of our true history, has affected our present and the high levels of poverty in our communities. And so when you're living in poverty, you actually don't get to move around that much, because you don't have the finances to be able to travel interstate or travel overseas. You're with your family and the things that
Yeah.
are around you locally. And so COVID, in some instances, didn't feel like it was impacting Aboriginal people's lives. And so I think that tells us a lot about privilege and poverty and how that's playing out even here in Australia. And then
Yeah.
obviously with our chronic health needs, the reality is Australia has not closed the gap. We still are dying 11 to 17 years younger than the non-Indigenous population in Australia with very complex health needs. And some of those are related to the true history. So, up until 1967 and even the early 1970s, the stolen wages, Aboriginal people were paid in tea, sugar, flour, and
Wow.
blankets. But if your diet is tea, sugar, flour for decades, there's obvious health outcomes. It's the high
Yes.
rates of diabetes, the kidney disease that we're facing today. And so then to put on a global pandemic and COVID into already complex health needs, um, was very confronting and scary. And I think particularly for our children and young people, because our elders are so important, and when they're already facing sickness, to then be faced with this global sickness was quite frightening. So I think also because of that poverty, many Aboriginal children and young people don't have access to the same kind of technology and devices that non-Indigenous Australians have as well. So that disconnection and their education, I think, has been
Education.
affected as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. So, going on to education, I've seen a school in Coffs Harbour. It's the first bilingual Indigenous school in New South Wales. Can you talk with us a bit about the importance of the effects for young Aboriginal peoples learning in their own language? And I'd love to hear about your own language.
Yes, I'd love to talk about language. That school in Coffs Harbour is such a great example and has brought so much excitement for me personally, but I think for many Aboriginal peoples about what is actually possible. And
Yeah.
we've had these dreams for so long, and so to see a dream like that come to reality is just so exciting. Uh, Even in terms of my own language, I haven't had my Wakka Wakka language, but a few weeks ago, the State Library of Queensland came out to Wakka Wakka country and held a workshop. And I was part of the first group of Wakka Wakka people to be learning our language. So it's amazing that we have access to this incredible dictionary of our language that's been held by the State Library of Queensland. But it's the very
Wow.
first time we're learning our language, which
Okay.
brought one of the elders to tears. The first time he heard some Wakka Wakka words, and so yeah, it's just so important. And language is such a vital part of culture. And I've been campaigning and talking for a long time in the Northern Territory. The children going to school often they can speak at least 4 Aboriginal languages, and then English is their 5th language. But
Wow.
the previous governments have refused to teach in Indigenous languages, and they've only been able to teach in English, even though every one of those kids knows a common language out of those, say, 4 Aboriginal languages, and they've got elders in the community who can speak language and teach in the language. And so we're just starting to see that change now, which is just amazing. I just can't wait to see the educational outcomes, that you don't have to learn English first to then be able
Yeah.
to learn maths and science and so forth. And so there's so much I think the rest of Australia can learn, from Aboriginal peoples and our language. I'm encouraging people to learn an Aboriginal word a week. It might be from the local area where you live, or another area, and just keep our languages alive.
Oh,
And
amazing. Yeah, that's a good challenge for me. So, yeah,
yes, yeah,
thank you. I'm
yeah,
going to try that.
yeah, that'd be great.
And so, what is, Brooke, what do you think the connection then is for young people learning in their own language? What do you envision, or what do you hope will change for young people learning in their own language?
Well, for starters, it removes a barrier, to learning.
Okay.
Secondly, it shows that our languages are just so beautiful and diverse, and they've been here for thousands of years. And so when people appreciate our languages, it restores that sense of um, pride and excitement about our culture and our peoples. It gives us a place of honor instead of being, uh, you know, um, peoples who couldn't, needed English to survive, and
Yeah.
that's not the case. And so to celebrate that today is just so exciting.
Yeah.
So I think it brings hope,
Yeah.
hope for our young people and hope for the future, and um, yeah, and that non-Indigenous people want to learn these languages. That's super exciting that we've got this special thing to be able to share.
Yeah. I mean, when I visited New Zealand, they often have Maori terminology. I was at a school library, and they had labels, Maori labels, all over the library and all over the school. And I came back wondering why we weren't doing that in Australia, because I come from a country where they also speak 11 official different languages, and the importance of that in my country's history. And yeah, I think that would be a beautiful thing if we saw more of that in Australia.
That's right. And I mean, that's a very special thing that newer migrants and people from other countries who've come here to these lands now called Australia, to remind Australians that, you don't just need English. Like, to know
Yeah,
there's 11 official languages in another country, we can learn from our international
yeah,
friends as well. And so I hope that Australia takes that posture of learning. What has happened in New Zealand, Aotearoa, is actually the nation coming together about 30 years ago, and collectively going on that journey, as well as that they have the Treaty of Waitangi. But it was
okay.
actually a conscious decision about 30 years ago. This is what my Pakeha and Māori friends tell me. And so sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, does that mean Australia's 30 years behind? But I think we can use it as an encouragement, and we're
Yeah,
starting to see the glimpses of it today.
yeah, beautiful. And also, Brooke, you presented at the Queensland Parliament Community Support and Services Committee about raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 years old to 14. And as a psychologist, I look at that and go, I'm so glad you're campaigning for this, because 10 years old is, they're such babies. And so, I understand. I've heard people in Australia, there's kind of two camps broadly. Some people will say, well, if young people are badly behaved or they're violent offenders, we need to just clamp down on their behavior, and that's that. Other people will say, well, yep, Australia's now reaping what they've sown, and it's kind of none of our business. We need to just let Aboriginal peoples deal with that on their own. And so it's nothing we can really do. What do you believe we need to do? What do our young people need from us?
Our young people, and even to especially remember, these are children. Um,
Yes.
our children need love and care and support and encouragement. They're not going to find that in a jail cell. Um,
Yeah.
and so, even if we step back from it as mainly looking as Aboriginal children, what do we want as the nation of Australia? We're getting condemned by the United Nations. Internationally, the recommended age is 14 years. Aboriginal peoples have been campaigning for this hashtag raise the age for many years, but particularly very intensively over the last 3 years. And in 2020, the government changed the Closing the Gap targets and said that the Attorney Generals of each state and territory just needed another 12 months to consider that. That 12 months rolled around in 2021 to raise the age, and they still said they needed more time. Then came proposed legislation in Queensland and this parliamentary inquiry I got to speak at. Only last week it was rejected and voted down. And every one of the submissions, except for two, and there were, I think, 3,000 submissions, and only two said not to raise the age. And so you're going against what the community wants as well. And so it just makes no sense. But what is the present and the future we want for our children? Because there's been enough research to say when our young people or any young person enters the juvenile justice system, they are so likely to end up in the adult prison system.
Yeah.
And I think, you heard me say that we're sending 10-year-olds to jail. I think that's what a lot of non-Indigenous people don't realise, is that a detention centre isn't a fun and games place, it's jail. In Queensland, every one of the 10-year-olds is Aboriginal. And, I also encourage people to go and read the words of the statement from the heart. And there's words that, and read it out loud, actually let the words come into your heart. There's a particular line, whilst the statement from the heart calls for voice, treaty and truth, there's a part in there that says, we are the most, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, mainly Aboriginal people, are the most incarcerated people on the planet. And we are not an innately criminal people. But part of what is playing out is that racism. So I encourage people, if you want to enter the discussion, go and watch the whole day's proceedings of where I presented. I was only allowed to give a 3-minute speech, and then there was question time. But myself and Auntie Bonnie Robinson, who's another amazing Aboriginal Christian leader, saying the same things. There's no time to delay this any further.
No.
We're ready to go. Please release our young people. And to know that your passionate pleas are, they seem to be heard, but it's still denied. It just doesn't make sense to me. And one of the reasons they're not raising the age is because they're like, well, what do we do with these young people? And so I said, I'm actually a chartered accountant, one of only 30 Indigenous chartered accountants in all of Australia. And so I said to the committee, I sit here. They said those between the ages of 10 and 14 in Queensland, you're only talking about 83 children and young people in any 1 year. So it's not actually that many people, young people we're talking about, 83. And I said, well, if we go with that, it's $100,000 per year. If we estimate $100,000 per year to keep one of these 83 young people in jail. And the committee stopped me and they said, oh, no, Miss Prentis, it's actually $250,000 per year. And so I was making the case of, I hope they had someone doing financial modelling about ways of reinvestment, but of course they don't have anyone. But $250,000 per year is probably 2.5 social workers full-time per child, which would make so much more difference than having them taken away from their family, their culture, their community, their education and schooling. And so I just hope we can dream of a different present and future. And the other reason I encourage people to watch the whole proceedings, you had incredible non-Indigenous foster carers begging for the age to be raised. Lawyers, non-Indigenous lawyers who are working with our young people. And because, there's that rhetoric out there that, well, Aboriginal people and our young people are committing more crimes or more violent crimes. And it's actually not true. Like there was one example, and this is on the public record, a young person in a out-of-home care environment They had an item of personal property removed from them and placed in a room. They went into the room and it was locked, and so they broke the lock to retrieve their personal property in their own home. And they went in
Gosh.
and out of the room several times, and they were charged with like 5 counts of break and enter.
Oh,
And
man.
so that's then on your record and what sends you to jail for a long time. And so it's people to actually understand what's happening. Another situation in their own home, it was an out of care home situation, but it's now their home, and they flicked their foster sibling with a tea towel. They were charged with assault.
Oh, Brooke, that's
So this is
heartbreaking.
what's happening to our precious children and young people.
Wow. And so have
And
you
people can go and
seen
listen to the lawyers for themselves. That's what I encourage people to do. This is all on the public
Good.
record. Actually, if you want to have a conversation about this, go and learn from the people who are at the front line.
Yeah, go and research. So have you seen, or do you have examples or stories of Aboriginal elders or community leaders working together with the police where they're really doing some great work with young people that you see in a positive way?
Yes, absolutely. There's many communities and there's many great police officers as well. And yes, so people can go and learn those stories as well. I think sadly though, it's more the exception than the general situation.
Right.
And I think whilst it's good to have that relationship with the police, and a positive relationship with the police, we actually need to tackle poverty and injustice and racism, and not just leave it to the police.
Yeah.
And so they're important things to look at as well.
And so your work in schools, what do you do? What when I know you're going into schools a lot, what are you doing at the moment to teach young people about Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal culture?
Yeah, so it's been really wonderful to be able to go into schools. I've been doing schools work for the last 10 years, but now it's kind of like what I'm doing full time. And I'm just loving it. It's especially about being able to, with our teachers, to equip and empower them, particularly with teaching how to embed the Indigenous perspectives in curriculum. To help it become real and tangible by having an Aboriginal friend who comes in and walks alongside the teachers, but then can come into the classrooms and work with the students. And, one of the special stories, I show the students the Aboriginal map of Australia and talk about my culture and my peoples, and share many stories. And they're often learning dreaming stories, but for me to say what that dreaming story actually means, and how it's
Okay.
connected to land and people and culture, and how it weaves the law together, like how to look after, to know who the creator is, how to look after creation, and how to live in right relationship. And that these are qualities that Aboriginal people have displayed for thousands of years and still today. To see the teachers come alive and the students come alive is just so wonderful. And I guess for someone, I really believe to tackle injustice, I think will come through relationship, and especially
Yeah.
I call reconciliation friendship. And because we know what a friend is, you celebrate together, you have times of joy, you listen to one another. And this is what I get the young people to tell me. This is often their responses. They even say you tell the truth to each other, you care for each other, you're there in the sad times as well. And so for us here in these lands now called Australia, to think of reconciliation that way with non-Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, I think it would be able to close the gap quite soon if we were able to embrace that concept of friendship. And so,
Yeah.
but yes, I can't teach all of Australia, but to be working with educators who are teaching so many generations, and to see that happening in our schools, It can't be the only place it's happening to bring about that truth telling on a
Yeah.
national scale and ending injustice and racism. It will take all aspects of society, but to see that happening in our schools and people actually being able to have an Aboriginal friend and
Yeah.
remembering our leadership and our stories and bringing our culture alive, that it's not just this ancient culture, it's alive today in the Aboriginal peoples who are in every part of these lands now called Australia.
So, Brooke, then for people like me, or parents who are listening who are not Indigenous Australians, what can we do that is supportive of Indigenous teenagers and their families without being offensive or hurtful? What advice do you give us?
Yes, I think it's firstly, and if you don't have many Indigenous teens or children in your school communities, to still be asking the executive at the school and the teachers, how are they teaching Indigenous perspectives in the
Okay.
curriculum, that's important for you as a parent, because those things will help to change Australia to make it a better Australia for our Indigenous teens and young people. And so your context and what you can do in your context is really important as well. But if you don't raise your voice to your school, yes, we've heard about the wonderful work I'm doing in schools, but there's still a long way to go in many schools. Many schools still aren't
Yeah.
celebrating NAIDOC Week or National Reconciliation Week. If you're a parent listening and you've never heard of NAIDOC Week or National Reconciliation Week, go and find out what those are and ask your school to participate in them. It's a great way to build relationship with your local Aboriginal community. And then when you do know Indigenous teens and young people, it's to build them up in their culture. That as a non-Indigenous parent and young person, you care for who they are and their identity. Remind them that they come from the world's oldest living continuing cultures and how special you think that is, and how you would love to learn from them. Can they share with you about their culture? It's also remembering that they might not know their culture yet, because Australia is still a culturally unsafe place in many places,
Okay.
even our schoolyards. Sadly, our schoolyard is where we first experience an injustice, which is usually our first experience of racism as an
Yeah.
Aboriginal child or young person. And racism, discrimination have huge impacts on our mental health. So make sure you're talking to your kids about what Aboriginal, your teens and young people, what Aboriginal people look like. If they have an Aboriginal person come to their school, as a parent, you want to know about it. And, I was talking to my friends who are non-Indigenous parents one day, and uh, in one particular area, it's usually year threes that learn about stolen generations, and their son was in year three. And I said, "Oh, have they learnt about it at school?" And the parents are like, "Oh, no, I don't think they've done anything." Then they called the little fella over and they asked him about the stolen generations, and he talked for 15 minutes educating his parents about the stolen generations. So make it a conscious conversation with your own
Yeah.
teens, children, and young people about what are they learning at school, and do they have Indigenous friends. Sometimes it's often in sporting teams, and encouraging them to get to know their Aboriginal friend. What country are they from, or are they part of the stolen generations? What issues are they facing every day? How can you be there to support and encourage them?
Yeah, I'm so grateful for those relationships that my children have had. My daughter befriended an Aboriginal teenager. Well, she was preteens at that stage, and if Tracy's listening, hi Tracy, it's the mum. Um, but I'm so grateful for that time that my daughter got to learn from Tracy's daughter. Uh, and the times my children have been, involved with Indigenous communities, because I've learned. And so, yeah, I love how you gave that story about the mum calling the child over and the child teaching you, because I think as adults we can learn from our kids, and making it a very natural part of our conversations to talk about Indigenous culture and Aboriginal young people. So, Brooke,
Yeah.
what is your greatest hope for Aboriginal teens in Australia?
Oh, my greatest hope for Aboriginal teens is uh, into the future is that they don't have to justify their existence. That the burden would be lifted from them of having to do the truth telling. So I would love to see us as a nation do a truth telling commission where every Australian learns the true history. So when these Indigenous teens know about the massacres that have happened on their country, and then they tell their friends don't go, oh, massacres didn't happen. What are you talking about? That our Indigenous teens are believed when they
Yeah.
say that they're Aboriginal, that their identity isn't questioned. And, you know, I think as a 17-year-old Aboriginal girl, when I finished year 12, that was my greatest hope. And sadly, 25 years later, the Aboriginal students I'm actually working with in schools, they're still facing their Aboriginality being questioned. And so it's not something we can change. We need our non-Indigenous friends and brothers and sisters to change your families, your friends, your workplaces, your communities to make that future possible. And so that is my deep hope.
Thank you. Brooke, thank you so much for your time and just sharing so beautifully with us everything about your heritage and the ways that we can learn. We really appreciate you being on Raising Teens.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I hope the parents and teens and young people of Australia can be part of my dream. An Australia that we build together, an Australia built on truth, justice, love, and hope. And I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you.